Right, it really feels like I've been losing my mind a bit over this aspect, because apparently this isn't an ability. Trying to wrap my head around this aspect in the way that Bungie thinks it should work, versus the way the community thinks it should work, versus how it actually works, has been one of the weirdest experiences I've had in and around this game. If I was to ask you now what Ascension is, outside of just being an aspect, what would you say? Class ability? Ability? Nothing? Okay, how about class ability again? Ding. Bit of a weird one, but a sword? Ding. Could Ascension maybe be a dodge? Ding. Ugh. I wish this was a joke, but it's pretty much true. So let's answer the question that nobody was probably wondering before they clicked on this video. Here's the kahuna, lol. I like making Destiny builds and VGM, but you're probably here for this, not this. But a while back I was working on an Ascension build video that uses an Inmost Light Coyote class item with Ascension. When I got into making the build, I noticed during my gameplay that something didn't feel right. Something just wasn't clicking, and as I was looking back over my footage, I noticed that Inmost Light wasn't proccing on Ascension. Me thinking, oh, that's a really annoying bug, so I went into my script for that build video and went on to say, Ascension is bugged currently, doesn't work with Inmost Light. And I kept on going with the build as it was working well even without the Inmost regen on Ascension. Then I went to go test armor mods, and anything that mentioned on using a class ability in its description wasn't working either. Right, bit of a bummer, guess my super spam mod setup ain't gonna cut it here, and this bug was a bit more serious than I thought. Well, okay, at least I can use something like Slice on my gun, so I can make a Tangle to grapple to, and looks like any weapon perks that mention class ability also won't work. Going through my mind now was, damn, this is a pretty serious bug, and I don't think this one's got a lot of traction. It's not proccing anything that mentions class ability, which it should be doing, and it's not even working with Spirit of Inmost Light, which is just labelled as ability. At this point, Ascension basically isn't anything, not a class ability or even an ability. So then, as I do with bugs, this is foreshadowing, I go to Bungie Help and make a post. I go and test with any hunter exotics I can find that I think would be relevant here. I tested ones that mentioned dodging, which all didn't work, but that's fair enough because Ascension's pretty clearly not a dodge. Then Dragon Shadow worked perfectly. The base exotic that specifically uses the wording dodge worked with Ascension. And then I look at the exotic class item and see the wording's been changed from dodge to class ability. The only reason they could have to change it to class ability from dodge would be to make sure that this works with Ascension. There is no other aspect that modifies your dodge in a movement sense of Prismatic, and as class items are only usable on Prismatic, this change could only be for allowing that exact interaction of Ascension and Spirit of the Dragon to work. And then to my surprise, I was really happy to see that Falcon's exotic perk was also working here, with the reserve overshield that it gives you on using a class ability, working from Ascension, with the exotic using that specific wording again, class ability. So up to this point, this aspect doesn't work with mods or weapons that say class ability, but it does work with exotics that say class ability, yet it doesn't work with Inmost Light, which just reads as an ability, but does work with an exotic that says dodge. So now, with everything tested, I hop into Bungie Help. I was testing with Ascension and noticed that it wasn't working with almost all exotic / weapon perks and mods that mention class ability. I know for some of the exotics listed below, they explicitly state dodging, but I'm assuming with at least some of these Ascension should be working. At the very least, it definitely wasn't working with class ability related triggers. I state the list of exotics I tested and mention that Dragon Shadow and Falcon's works, then go on to list the weapon perks and armor mods it doesn't work with. With so much hard evidence, surely I'll hear back from Bungie Help saying that they're looking into this and that they appreciate the heads up on being told about the bug. And people, this is where we get down what I can only call the Ascension rabbit hole. Remember when I said at the start that I was losing my mind a little over this whole thing? Yeah, that pretty much starts here. I don't hear back from Bungie help, instead I get a message back from someone else. They dropped a comment with an abstract taken from a Bungie help post back on the 13th of June, so at the time of seeing it, over 6 months ago, with a link to the original post of someone who had a very similar question. Ascension not working with most armor mods. I was doing some testing with the new Hunter aspect Ascension and found that Distribution, Reaper, Bomber, Outreach and Powerful Attraction did not activate. Only Utility Kickstart worked for me. Bungie help speaking now. Hi there. Thanks for reaching out. Although Ascension can consume your class gauge when used in the air, it isn't a class ability, so it won't trigger mods that require class abilities to activate. The hell you say this can't proc class ability related things? It says consume your class ability, it takes away my class ability. That's your proc class ability stuff. At this point, I don't know what this thing even is. According to Bungie, it's not a class ability, and according to Inmost Light, it's not even an ability, but Dragon Shadow disagrees with that because it's actually a dodge and a class ability, and Falcons has also hopped on the bandwagon as this is a class ability. So you can imagine my surprise when I dig a little deeper into trying to perform what is some thesis level research at this point to discover that this ability that's not actually an ability, it's really a dodge, but actually it's not a dodge, it's a class ability, is really just a sword. If you put on a sword and hold it out then use Ascension, it then inherits the perk of that sword. Ever wanted a chain reaction incandescent Ascension? Yup, here it is. How about a Cloud Strike Ascension? Sorted. Want to heal with Ascension? Use Lament. Want a slowing Ascension? Chuck on Cold Steel. How about Colony? Yeah, it can do it. So let's recap. This aspect isn't an ability, and it's not a class ability, and it's not a dodge, because what it actually is a dodge and a class ability. What I thought was a bug of it not activating class ability related mods was actually intentional, so you can take away that it not working with class ability weapon perks is intentional, and that Falcons and Dragon Shadow working on Ascension is what's actually bugged here in Bungie's mind, as they mention class ability, which Ascension isn't, because it consumes it, not uses it. What's also a bug is that this can become Lament, Cloud Strike or Colony, as this aspect is actually cosplaying as a sword. I don't think there is a single person right now who can actually give me a straight answer as to what this is. I see myself as a decent build crafter, and I've been testing with this ability, class ability, dodge, sword? See? It just exists in absolutely no category, and somehow all of them at the same time, whilst being inconsistently consistent of being either. Okay, this is going to be the more feedback side of the video. In all honesty, Ascension here is the worst of the bunch, but it makes for a good anecdote in that this keeps on happening with abilities in the game. Part of the reason that I've been spurred on to make this video after fully dropping the idea a few months back is that Bungie again did the same thing with Ionic Sentry. They released it and it had absolutely no interactions, didn't count as an ability, didn't work with Electrostatic Mind, didn't work with anything that mentioned Grenade, so Spark is Shock, Firepower, Ashes to Assets, you name it, if the word Grenade was in the description, odds are it didn't work with Ionic Sentry. Bungie then goes on saying that they're fixing it, and when they eventually get round to doing so, I was so excited. I could finally put together my Verity's Brow Ionic Sentry build, damage buffing the Sentry, and using Spark of Shock to be jolting a load of enemies. I get into the game, get testing, and my heart sinks to find out that it's still not coded as a grenade, only now a plain arc ability. Same thing happened with Quickfall. Got released, didn't count as a melee even though it consumes a melee ability, and identically to Ascension, Ensnaring Slam had all the same problems of not being counted as a class ability. Now, I don't want to be too gung-ho in throwing around the word bug, because if Bungie makes something I just don't like or agree with mechanically, I can't go and call that a bug. But it's so difficult to tell whether something in this game is bugged or not. To bring Ascension back into the fold with what I just said before, posts on Bungie Help that Bungie replied to were saying that Ascension was built in such a way that it not having interactions was intentional. fast forward to now, and lo and behold, after people flooding to sites like Bungie Help or Reddit, all thinking that this was a bugged interaction, and Bungie then does a full 180 on their stance, and it's now listed as a known issue. So was this a bug all along, or were people right for calling it that? Who knows. Ionic Sentry is in an even weirder spot. The fix for this ability has technically happened. It's now considered an arc ability. But if you cast your gaze to Bungie Help, you'll see that one of the more popular posts about Ionic Sentry being bugged brings up its lack of grenade synergy, and there is acknowledgement from Bungie here saying that they're aware of the issue. Exact wording in big fat letters. You're correct, there are indeed known issues affecting Ionic Sentry, which are as you described. Then, if you look at the game, everything that works in a similar way to Sentry acts like a grenade. Bleakwatcher functions fully like a grenade. Every grenade synergy works, and the wording between Bleakwatcher and Ionic Sentry is identical, with both of them being considered turrets. You might then argue that Bleakwatcher costs a grenade and Ionic Sentry doesn't, but Gunpowder Gamble acts in an almost identical way when charging up, but fully benefits from grenade synergies like Spirit of Verity, Ember of Resolve, Firepower, so on and so forth. So what exists in the game currently would indicate that Ionic Sentry should act like a grenade, and what we've seen from Bungie Help lines up with that too. But we got the fix, so is this still bugged? Can I call this bugged after it technically got its fix? Herein lies the problem, we don't know. Bungie doesn't do a great job at communicating this specific issue, and it worries me that in the future, one day I'm going to go to Bungie's well-known issue list and see something along the lines of the Ionic Sentry aspect isn't working with certain armor mods, fragments, and exotic armors, as if this wasn't how it should have been in the first place. This is really the reason I made this video. I want to see changes made to abilities so that they line up and make sense with what exists in the rest of the sandbox and with what Bungie themselves say on their own forums. This is the big change I want. If an ability is used and it takes up a spot in your grenade, melee, class ability box, or consumes a grenade, melee, or class ability, it should be considered identically to one. This one change would bring everything much closer, much more consistent, and make it all much more understandable. No more having to go on a wild goose chase through Bungie help posts to try find the answer on whether something is bugged or not. And I'd also love to see abilities adjusted so that if the source of whatever made something was damage boosted, that transfers to everything made by it later on down the line. A good example that comes to mind would be, for example, a Mindspun Invocation grapple melee damage boosted by Verity's Brow. When you land that grapple melee and spawn in 3 threadlings, because the melee damage was boosted and that was the source of what made the threadlings, they'd inherit that damage boost too. This already exists in the game with how shatters and ignitions are damage boosted by the source that created them, so it's not a massive stretch for it to be applicable to more abilities and subclasses. To be honest, I'm coming at this whole argument of abilities purely for wanting build crafting in this game to become deeper rather than regress. I think the more interaction heavy a build is, the more interesting the builds in this game become, and Bungie knows how to make great interactions. I think the way that Scorch interacts with ignitions is really cool, and it's a shame to see more mechanics like that not be in the game that could be. I'll leave it at that though, there's more I could talk about here, but it detracts away from the point I really want to make about abilities, which I feel I've done as good as I could. I hope Bungie makes good changes to abilities in the future, I hope they tighten up their communication a bit, and I hope that we don't get into situations again where there's a repetition of release ability / exotic and then wait months later for a patch to fix up whatever should have been there in the first place. That's about it from me though, and if you want to keep up the discussion, you'll hopefully find some like-minded people in the comments, plus me, I'll be floating around down there too. Anyway, that's it.